Hi, so here is the long-promised Norway video. And I must say, Norway, I'm happy to report, turned out to be a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. This isn't just one of my usual videos where like, here's a small country, let's see what they do with their money, does it make sense? This is more specific than that. This is a small country with a lot of money that actually has a land border with Russia. This is a frontline state and a super long coast that borders very strategically important waters. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. It really actually helps. And then also, if you feel so inspired, feel free to throw some money my way, either using the thanks button here on YouTube or by buying me a coffee using the link in the description below. You can also become a member, which would make you, well, easily one of the coolest people on earth. And I think that's a very important distinction to be able to say. You could have that on your resume. I, according to Michael Shirkin, am one of the coolest people on earth. It's pretty cool, huh? All right. So, as I often do in these videos, I want to focus on Norwegian defense policy first, both historically and now. What are they thinking? What were they thinking? What should they be thinking? And then in another part two, I'm going to do an overview of the Norwegian armed forces, branch by branch, to see what they've got, what they're spending their money on. And then finally, in part 3, we're going to try to put it all together. And yes, I put timestamps below in the description. So part 1, Norwegian defense policy. Before the German invasion in 1940, Norway favored an armed neutrality and tried to avoid aligning with any blocs. In real terms, though, this didn't really mean much. They didn't really do much because Norway didn't really spend a lot of money, particularly in the interwar period. Norway was convinced that things like the League of Nations would keep everybody safe. So why spend money on military? Well, we all know how well that worked out. And 1940, Germany invaded Norway and occupied it through the remainder of the war. Norway was not liberated. The Germans simply surrendered in May of 1945 and left. It's a very different sort of thing. So basically, the entire remainder of the war, Norway was under German occupation, which they didn't really like. Consequently, World War II was a turning point for Norway, which, like Belgium and the Netherlands, concluded that the smart play was to throw itself into the arms of the Pax Americana and invest far more money in defense than it had previously. So, 1949, for example, Norway was a founding member of NATO. Norway's defense budget I find this is interesting as a point of comparison, like the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and then after World War II. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Norwegian defense budget is about, according to the estimates that I was able to find, 1.5% of GDP, which kind of sounds like a fairly healthy amount. I mean, it's not the 3% that it used to be during the Cold War, but 1.5 is not nothing. However, 1.5 in the 1920s and 1930s actually is not much money because it's 1.5% of a fairly small number. Norway was a relatively poor country. These days, it's now about 2% and climbing, but of a much, much larger economy. So I found, for example, that Norway's real GDP per person is about 3 to 4 times what it used to be before World War II, which implied that there was like at least a 200 to 300% increase per capita from the late 1930s to the present. That's per capita, and there are also more people. Out of curiosity, I asked AI, I work with an AI called perplexity.com to try to figure out how much money Norway spent on defense in absolute terms. So I gave it the year 1930. How much did they spend in 1930 and how does that compare to today? So the numbers I came up with are the following. These are all sort of guesstimates here. Well, not hopefully better than guesstimates, they're estimates. In 1930, Norway spent about 70 to 90 million kroner, which at the time worked out to about 10 to 20 million US dollars. So 10 to 20 million US dollars, it's not a lot. In today's terms, so if you convert that to 2025 dollars, that meant that Norway was spending only about 130 to 170 million dollars. That's not a lot of money. These days in 2025, now that's spending 2%, but 2% of a much larger GDP, Norway is spending anywhere from 10 to 11 billion dollars. If any of you have any issues with these estimates of the numbers, please feel free to weigh in the comments. Okay, so either way, we agree that post-1940, Norway is keen on having a robust military and is willing to pay for one. But what kind of military? Now, in Norway's case, perhaps more than many other countries, geography really is everything. Here's a map to which I will refer several times. And I've circled on this map the border with Russia, and I've also put a big red dot to mark the location of the big Russian port and submarine base in Murmansk. Basically, if you're Russia and you want to get ships into the Atlantic, you either have to, or do it quickly, right? Meaning you're not going to go around from the Pacific, or you're not going to go from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, right? You have to go either through the Baltic, which is now a NATO island, and a NATO lake, or north around Norway. And then you have to decide if you want to slip in between Norway and the UK, or between the UK and Iceland, or Iceland and Greenland, the so-called the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, the GI-UK gap. Do you see it? You see how this works out? Norway, therefore, occupies a really critical piece of territory, even if it's only because of the waters that border Norway. So the land itself, in and of itself, might not be a prize, but the coast, and because of the waters near it, really, really is a prize. This also means that Norway doesn't have the choice of playing like Switzerland and saying, oh, we can put our heads in the sand and pretend that nothing matters, because the fact of the matter is, like in world wars, nobody really needed Switzerland to pursue their war aims, whereas it's pretty clear that just as Germany felt obliged to invade Norway in World War II, in a World War III scenario, somebody's going to feel the need to use Norwegian territory, again, even if only to be able to control the waters off the Norwegian coast. So what does this tell us? What kind of military does Norway need? They clearly need a military, but what kind? Well, I think the obvious choice here is you need a navy, a pretty good navy. What kind of navy? We're going to get into that. You also need an air force, a fairly large one. And I think this is all the more important given the fact that you've got these mountains, the mountainous terrain. From what I understand, the road connectivity with a lot of the communities up in the north are not that great. So, there's like only one way to get from point A to point B, which is bad because that way can be cut off. So again, aircraft are going to be really important. What about an army? That's less obvious to me. I mean, Norway is a lot like Chile in that it's long and thin and it's got all these mountains, so it's really hard to invade through most places. It's not a country in which you can conduct sweeping armored maneuvers or anything like that, although the Germans in 1940 did send armored elements, but they were not like they did in France, right, or Ukraine or the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was more, I believe, sort of small numbers of armored vehicles to support infantry as they would take over things like towns and cities. But still, there are open bits, there are communities, there are populous areas, mostly close to the water. And as I mentioned, the Norwegians do have some memories about what it was like to be occupied by the Germans in World War II, and they did not really like the experience. So they do care about territorial defense, even, on the ground. Now, we need to add something to this that's sort of into the mix, which I find really interesting. This is something I did not actually know about until I started looking at it, which is that Norway, it seems under pressure from the Soviet diplomats, decided or like as part of the deal when they joined NATO, they had certain caveats or certain rules that Norway was going to, self-imposed rules that Norway was going to stick by in order to try to reduce the perceived threat that it posed to the Soviet Union. So there are basically three caveats. One, no nuclear weapons on Norwegian territory in its airspace or waters. Two, no permanent, emphasis on permanent, foreign military bases. And three, there would to be a limited military presence, whether Norwegian or NATO, in Norway's far north, specifically an area referred to as Finnmark. That's the bit of Norway that's like up against the Russian border. I cannot imagine what the weather is like up there. It must be really freaking cold. And the thought of fighting a war there, like I pity the poor grunt who's got to go out in that kind of environment and fight. Interestingly enough, at least in the 80s, what the Norwegians did to get around some of these caveats is that they had liberal definitions of the basing requirements. So, for instance, instead of having a permanent base, what you have are rotations where troops would rotate through, NATO troops would rotate through. They also came up with a scheme for pre-positioning large quantities of American equipment. And beginning in the 80s, there were, I think early 80s, the Norwegians and the Americans set up these several giant, mostly underground facilities in which the United States Marine Corps put equipment and ammunition, supplies, and all sorts of stuff. Apparently, from what I've read, enough stuff to fully equip a Marine Expeditionary Brigade of about 15,000 Marines and keep them running, operational for 30 days. So no Marines, but all their stuff. So you still have to get the Marines to Norway, but at least you're not making a permanent foreign base. Pretty clever, huh? From what I understand, Norway today sticks to the no nuclear weapons thing. It has relaxed the restrictions on military activities in Finnmark. There are more exercises, more training. Plus, also from what I understand, particularly since 2017 and 2022, the Norwegians have been expanding their military footprint up there in the Finnmark. And from what I understand now, really the Norwegian military, at least the army, is concentrated up north, in the far north. And also, Norway's partnership with the United States Marine Corps is alive and well. They are frequent visitors, and I believe that the equipment that the U.S. has stored in Norway is routinely refreshed and replaced, and everything is in working order. So it's not like it's this time capsule from the 1980s when the U.S. Marine Corps first started storing stuff. I mean, that'd be pretty cool if it were, right? Like, oh, you crack it open, and it's like, here's all this 1980s kit. It sort of reminds me. In Washington, D.C., there are fallout shelters from the Kennedy era, and there's one in one of my kids' middle school, and I used to give tours. It was actually a fundraiser for the school, but I would give tours of the fallout shelter from like 1961, 1962. It's like deep in the basement of the school. And what was neat is that like some of the supplies from 1961 or 1960, whatever, were still there on these shelves. So there were these boxes full of biscuits and crates of water and various medical supplies. I mean, all dated like 1961, 1962. Super cool. Anyways, the Marine Corps' caves, their underground facilities are not like that. It's all modern, current stuff. Now, to return more to the basic question of Norwegian military policy, if we were to generalize, like if you want to ask, like, well, how has it evolved? I would say that it's safe to say that over the course of the 20th century, it has mostly focused on territorial defense. You discourage invasion, and then you deal with the invasion, both in terms of the littoral waters, the coast, and also the ground. Up until after the Cold War, when there was this 20-year hiatus, when the Norwegians, like everybody else in Europe, cut their budgets, they cut the size of the force, and they moved to a more expeditionary model designed for force projection and to participate in NATO and UN missions. It was in the spirit, for example, that Norway sent F-16s into the fray in Libya. I read that the Norwegian F-16s played a disproportionately large role in terms of like the bombing runs and that kind of thing. The Norwegians also sent over 9,000 troops to Afghanistan. 10 of them died. And the Norwegian Navy sent at least one frigate to do counter-piracy stuff off of Somalia. I think it was called Operation Atalanta, which was like a European Union kind of thing. But then came Ukraine, and Norway went back to basics. So we're back to territorial defense. We're back to spending more money, so we're going to spend more money. Not a force as large as the Cold War force, a smaller force, but now there's much more money, so this smaller force is going to be extremely well equipped with all sorts of fancy stuff. So it follows that the budget, which dropped after the Cold War to about 1.3% GDP in the early 2000s, so kind of like what it was in the interwar period, but remember, it's a percentage of a much larger economy, so it's still a much larger number in absolute terms. Now it's gone up to a bit over 2%, and it's on track to go even higher. And in terms of constant dollars, from what I understand, basically the Norwegian defense budget has doubled since the early 2000s, which is a lot of money. All right, part two, finally, an overview of the Norwegian military. We've set the stage about talking about Norway's military policy. Let's see what this looks like in real terms. Norway's military is small, but is highly professional, and I guess it's appropriate to say that it's armed to the teeth with top-shelf high-end weaponry. It's interesting to do a comparison. I already mentioned that, at least geographically, Norway is kind of like Chile in that it's like small, it's long but thin, so it doesn't have strategic depth in terms of its width. Chile, as I argued in my previous video, was all about strategic sufficiency in a context that's not particularly threatening. None of Chile's neighbors has weapons that are notably superior or numerous, and so thus the Chileans don't have to get top-shelf stuff. They can make do with secondhand equipment, with secondhand ships, secondhand tanks, with older fighter planes that they've maybe modernized somewhat, but they can get away with that in relatively modest numbers. Norway's a different sort of thing because Norway faces a much more dangerous environment than Chile does, simply because Norway is basically a frontline state. in terms of any kind of future World War III scenario or conflict with Russia. I mean, it was up and through the Cold War, certainly, but certainly I think we're back to that today. So it makes sense that Norway spends about twice what Chile spends in absolute terms. Total size of the force. The force has about, it's amazingly difficult to look up numbers when you're trying to find out how large a military is, because often the sources that will say, oh, the military of country X is X number, they're very lazy with regards to specifying, first of all, what branch, active versus reserve, what are you counting? And sometimes they're counting the one thing and then the other. So you never know if you're looking at apples to apples comparisons. For instance, if it says that country X has 10,000 and country Y has 20,000, but country Y might include some things that country X doesn't include, because it all depends on who's counting and that sort of thing. So it's very frustrating. And as a result, whenever I bring up numbers, the size of an army, the size of a military, often these numbers kind of approximate. It's what I'm finding on the internet. It's what I find during the research. And often it can be quarreled with. And so if you have a different idea of how many troops the Norwegians have, please weigh in the comments. I'm not insulted. I'm not like, oh, I'm not going to get defensive. I'm like, oh, thank you very much. That's helpful. I appreciate that. Anyways, according to what I read, the total size of the force of the Norwegian military is about 30,000 active duty. There's also a 40,000 strong home guard. They are reservists. There are also reservists that serve the other armies, this other branches. The home guard is not one of the branches. It's a separate branch. So Army, Navy, Air Force, home guard. So 30,000 active, plus 40,000 reservists who are part of the home guard, plus a few thousand reservists who are part of the other branches. The number I've seen for the total size of the Norwegian military when it's finally up to full wartime mobilization is about 70 to 75,000 people. Some 10,000 of these Norwegian troops are conscripts. They do still have conscription. They never got rid of it, but from what I understand, whereas in the Cold War, a large proportion of the troops active duty were conscripts. Now it's a much smaller proportion are active duty. Most of the active duty troops are still volunteers, and it's it's like they use a conscription to, for one thing, to retain the capacity to have a full military mobilization. So it's like you want to keep the muscles there so that you could do it if you need to, but then also just filling in the gaps in terms of the voluntary enlistment. The army, the Norwegian army very much definitely follows this line of that, what I said, it's small but extremely well equipped. So it has a total of, the number I found was 8,700. Most of the army is concentrated in the far north near Russia, and then there's a second node in the southeast near the population zones, population centers. I looked into how this compares with the Cold War force distribution, and it seemed to be that back then, the army, which was larger, maybe twice as large as it is now, was much more evenly distributed around the country and less concentrated towards near Russia. This was both because I think that they wanted to appear less offensively or less targeted, like less threatening to Russia, but also they liked this idea that by distributing the forces everywhere, that there were at least some regular active duty forces in every region of the country. So this is part of their way that they would kind of hedge risk. The big ticket items that the Norwegians have, they have 36 main battle tanks. These are Leopard 2A4s. They have 164 armored fighting vehicles. These are 7 CV-90s, which everybody loves. They have 363 armored personnel carriers. These are old M113s and relatively recent Patria Passis. These are, I think, 6x6 wheeled vehicles. They have these things called infantry, 233 infantry mobility vehicles of different kinds. They include Dingoes, Iveco LMVs, and the Supercat Extenda, just terrible name. And they have 28 self-propelled howitzers. These are Korean K9s. In addition to that, they also have 4 NASAM batteries. Those are medium-range air defense missiles. Norway has ordered 54 Leopard 2A8s to replace the older A4s. They also have on order 50 of these things called AC-SVG5s. They have 24 K9 Thunders on order, again, Koreans. And I think they've got more NASAM batteries coming, and then 6 Nomads. These are sort of short-range air defense systems. Norway also repeatedly is shopping for HIMARS. They used to have MLRS during the Cold War, but they got rid of them, and now they're like everybody else. They're starting to think that, maybe longer-range precision artillery is the way to go. So they're going to be buying some stuff. My super research assistant, Zach, who compiles these numbers, argues that perhaps Norway shouldn't bother with main battle tanks given the terrain, or certainly shouldn't bother with buying more new main battle tanks. And he thinks the money would be better spent maybe in the Navy. It's possible. I think that's a decent argument. From what I can tell just about that, my first thought was maybe it just depends on how the Norwegians conceive of using the tanks. From what I could tell, the tanks are meant to operate in the far north and provide shock and protective mobility in a direct clash with Russians. So I can only assume that the Norwegians, being familiar with the Finnmark, have this idea that, tanks are actually helpful up there, even if they're not necessarily helpful in other parts of the country. And the new Leopards are meant to work as part of an integrated, networked, combined arms force. And I believe that the upgrades and what they're investing in by buying the new Leopards is much more about the communications and the networking technology. Norway also has a second ground force, and this is the Home Guard that I referred to earlier. Has about 40,000 or 4,500 people in it. It's basically light infantry, and it's organized regionally. And its purpose is to serve sort of like it's a home defense thing. They back up the police. They back up the army. They have some quick reaction capabilities, and there's a sharp, pointy end of the stick that's sort of like a important counterterrorism capability. They're supposed to help with military mobilization. They're also supposed to help with local defense, securing the bridges, securing things of importance like that in the case of some sort of emergency. They do not officially have a stay-behind mission. Stay behind, the idea being that after the enemy rolls in, then some people stay behind where they're going to do partisan stuff and resistance stuff. So that's not officially part of the Home Guard's mission set, but from everything I've read, it seems to be implied. It's just not stated. And after all, the Home Guard, given their local organization and the familiarity with the local area, would be ideal for forming the nuclei of resistance groups and conducting guerrilla warfare efforts, etc. The Norwegians did this kind of thing during the German occupation, and I just kind of imagine that in the Norwegian imagination, that's kind of what they're thinking about doing, even if it's not stated officially so. Next, we get to Norway's Air Force. Having a large air force, a capable air force, makes sense. Norway's isn't particularly large, but its fleet is high-end, cutting-edge American. So it's got 4,680 people. The big ticket items include, and this is really important, 52 F-35As. They have 5 P-8 Maritime Patrol Anti-Submarine Warfare craft. These are new, which makes perfect sense given what Norway has to deal with. They have 4 transport aircraft, C-130s. This is the one thing Zach points us out, that maybe they should get more of these given the need for aircraft and aircraft transport. 4 seems like a small number. They have a whole bunch of utility helicopters. Norway, interestingly enough, counts among the countries that have had NH-90 helicopters but hated them. So they've been getting rid of them and replacing them with American MH-60 Seahawk helicopters for ASW and other mostly naval purposes. One of these days I should probably do a video about the NH-90 because it's really sort of this interesting story because everybody seems to hate it. I'm curious, is it fair? Is it not fair? What do they hate about it? I'll add to that the Norwegians do not operate dedicated attack helicopters like Apaches or Tigers. I would love to know the reason why not. And I say that because I assume that the Norwegians at least thought about it, asked the question, should we have these? And then had an answer to the question, no. I'd love to know what the reasoning is. I think it'd be really very interesting. The Norwegians also participate in NATO multinational programs like the multi-role tanker transport fleet, the MMF. There's a heavy airlift wing, etc., and something called the Alliance Ground Surveillance Force, or the AGS. These give Norway access to A330 MRTT tankers, C-17 cargo planes, and RQ-4 Global Hawk unmanned surveillance aircraft. The tankers does remind me, it does seem to be, that's one thing that looks like it's missing from the Norwegian fleet. Like they would probably need tanker aircraft without having to rely on NATO pooled tanker aircraft, because, when the balloon goes up, is that the expression? I don't understand the expression, but clearly those tankers are going to be in very short supply. So I feel like having a few of them organically would make a lot of sense. Finally, we get to the Navy. This is where I think things get really interesting, and particularly because I'm really interested in naval theory and naval doctrine. Understandably, given geography, Norway has a real focus on on its Navy and on thinking about the Navy and what kind of Navy it needs to have. Historically, its focus, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, has been on coastal and littoral defense and sea denial. This means coastal artillery, but also small but fast gunboats, torpedo boats, and subs. These are designed to fend off amphibious invasions and post-war to block the movement of Soviet ships from Murmansk. Sea denial is an interesting concept. I want to dwell on this, something I probably should have talked about more in some of my earlier videos. There are two terms that come up in opposition to one another. There's sea denial and then there's sea control. Wikipedia's definition of sea denial is basically preventing an enemy from using the sea. So you want to keep them out of the sea. Sea control is not just you can keep the enemy out, but you can use the sea and control it. So sea denial, you're not necessarily using the sea yourself, or you don't necessarily have the ability to prevent the enemy from attacking you while you're in said sea. It just means that you can keep the enemy out of said sea for certain periods of time. Sea control is like you really own the sea. It belongs to you and you're operating and you're doing whatever you want in the sea as if with impunity. Sea control is more ambitious. Sea control is ideal, but it's hard to do. Sea control tends to be associated with Alfred Thayer Mann, I don't know how it's pronounced, the American naval theorist from the late 19th century. Also, if you go for sea control, this usually means you need a big navy with big ships that can sink the enemy's fleet and take it off the board so you don't have to worry about it altogether. Sea denial is something that the British theorist Julian Corbett favored, basically arguing sea control wasn't really necessary and often wasn't even realistic. Castex kind of split the difference, and Castex argued that the sea control, the man vision, is ideal and best if you can do it, right? Like, not nice work if you can get it, but most of the time it isn't really that possible. And he had all sorts of advice for what to do if you're one of those navies that can't pull off sea control. But don't worry, there are all sorts of useful things you can do with your navy. And that's why I've often argued that Castex really is the best of the theorists for smaller militaries. So, and I wrote an article about that for War on the Rocks, and I put a link to that. It's like Castex for the non-hegemon or something like that, or the naval theorist for the non-hegemon. So I put a link for that in the description below. Anyway, Norway's navy historically has been very, I'm going to call it gynecolesque in its structure. I mean, to be clear, there's no evidence of any direct influence of the gynécole on Norway. Its navy said, hey, let's do the gynécole. It simply independently thought through its requirements and ended up with something similar to what the gynécole espoused. So basically this means like smaller forces and mobile forces, fast boats, torpedo boats, gunboats, submarines, that kind of thing. Also, there's this important thing that must be kept in mind, that the Norwegian Navy, at least in the post-war era, has always assumed that it would be working closely with the Royal Navy and the United States Navy, which raises then some questions like, do you replicate some of the capabilities of the Royal Navy? Do you try to complement some of the capabilities of the Royal Navy? What's the best way to fill out the team, to be part of the Royal Navy team and help it and help the collectives, help the allies in these waters? After the Cold War, the Norwegians briefly moved away from territorial defense to expeditionary operations, which actually meant more of a blue water fleet than they had before. So you want like blue water fleet with more multi-role vessels. Then came the invasion of Ukraine, and now we're back to territorial defense and all that implies. The Norwegian Navy has about 4,256 people in it. Their big-ticket items are impressive. They include 6 diesel-electric submarines of the Ula class. These are German-designed boats built, I believe, in Norway in the late 1980s and early 90s. 4 frigates of the Fridtjof Nansen class. There were 5 of them, but one of them was lost a few years ago. If you remember when it hit an oil tanker or something and sank. Oops. These were big boats built in the 2000s. And then you have 6 corvettes of the Skjold class and a fleet oiler. And on order, they've got 4 new Type 212 CD submarines and 5 Type 26 frigates. Now, given that the Fridtjof Nansen class boats are new, I was curious as to why they're going to replace them with these new 5 Type 26 frigates. It's a British ship. So from what I've read, the story is more or less this, that the Fridtjof, how's this pronounced? The Fridtjof Nansen class frigates reflected the thinking in that interlude after the post-Cold War, when the Norwegians are thinking about expeditionary operations. And so these are sort of blue water frigates that are true multi-role. They can do everything just about, but they're very much jacks of all trade, masters of none. The Type 26 frigates are meant to be more high-end and more specialized with respect to anti-submarine warfare. So they've got more of an emphasis on that. Thus, they're better and more sophisticated at the ASW, which Norwegians reckon in this new post-Ukraine war or Ukraine invasion context is really ultimately the key requirement. Never mind this multi-role expeditionary thing. It's all about the GR-UK gap. The Norwegians also seem to value the fact that these are British frigates. These are the same kind of frigates the Royal Navy's buying. So by choosing this Type 26, Norway is getting an identical or near identical platform to the Royal Navy's primary ASW frigate. And this creates a combined fleet of at least 13 of these things. 8 of them are UK, and 5 of them are going to be Norwegian, that can operate more or less interchangeably in the Barents Sea through to the GI-UK gap. This allows for shared upgrades, training, logistics, doctrine, and under the new, there's a new UK-Norway agreement that the two navies are going to run a de facto joint ASW anti-submarine warfare task group to protect the undersea cables, pipelines, and sea lanes of communication. All makes perfect sense to me. How much is Norway paying for its new Type 26 frigates? Well, if you have to ask, you really can't afford one. But seriously, I believe it works out to about $2.4 or $2.8 billion per boat for the full package. So with the hull, the ship, the weapons, the support, etc. It's a lot of money. Part 3, putting it all together. If you put it all together, and if you remember this map, it really all makes sense. You know, it's like that the meme or the joke, like you had one job. If you could say that Norway has one job, it is keeping Soviet subs out of the Atlantic, Soviet subs based in Murmansk, out of the Atlantic and out of the North Sea. That's its primary job. Along with that comes the need to protect some territory because one way to prevent Norway from doing that is by seizing its coastline. So you have to worry about the coastline. You have to have aircraft. You have to have troops. But really it's about the Navy, really is about the anti-submarine warfare and being able to shut down the Russian Navy and block them so that they can't escape out of the general area, the waters off of Norway. In that light, I think this all makes sense. You've got a smallish but robust and high-tech, high-end Navy. I mean, of course, there's always a debate to be had about quality over quantity. And, you know, is it a mistake to be spending so much money on these exquisite frigates when you end up with few of them? Maybe you want larger numbers of a cheaper thing so that you can absorb attrition, that kind of thing. Maybe there's that debate. And then you have this Air Force, which is operating F-35As, which are, you know, the bee's knees, apparently. And an army that's also no joke with these new Leopard 2A5s, 2A8s, and the CV90s, etc. So this is a serious force to be reckoned with. Plus, remember, this is all done in close coordination with the United States Marine Corps, because presumably if there's going to be a war, suddenly there'll be a U.S. Marine Corps brigade will land in Norway. That's the plan. And the British are there. And who knows who else might also show up if there's a fight. So I can see the Norwegians looking at this and thinking, okay, we've done all right. Maybe they need more transport planes. Like my research assistant, Zach, argues, maybe the money that they're spending on the new tanks would be better spent on the Navy. There's always the quantity versus quality issue. But by and large, it seems to me that Norway's posed to put up a really good fight if there were a conflict with Russia. And that's really what the point is. Thank you very much. I hope you liked this video. Again, please hit like and subscribe or throw some money my way. If you look in the description, you'll see links to my social media. I'm active on X and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. Plus, there's my own website, michaelshirkin.com, and my Substack, also called Pax Americana. I try to write for that at least weekly. And that's it. Stay tuned, and I hope to see you in my next video. There's plenty more in the pipeline. Bye-bye.